Okay, we are live.
All right, we're reconvening our morning meeting and shifting gears to H230, Act relating to the management of fish and wildlife, and we welcome Commissioner Shortsleeve and other fish and wildlife staff. Welcome.
Great. Thanks for having us. Just wanted to introduce Dr. Rosalind Renfrew, who's our Wildlife Diversity Program Manager, and then Dr. Katrina Geeter, and she is our research manager and statistician. And she has a PhD in ecological modeling. She's been working for the department going on 8 years now. So I just wanted to start by saying we really appreciate being able to come in and talk to you all, and we appreciate the committee's interest and concern in landscape conservation. Fish and Wildlife Department shares that same interest and concern, and that shows up in our work with Vermont Conservation Design and our work to maintain a healthy, ecologically functioning landscape in Vermont and throughout the whole Northeast region. We've come into this committee and testified before about the work that we do and how we focus on landscape connectivity and conservation. And we do that for a variety of reasons, including the assurance that fish, wildlife, and plants will be able to move and have access to all the resources they need as they adapt to a changing climate. And so when we talk about a feasibility study for the reintroduction of mountain lions, I think there's some important considerations that we discuss before we make an investment in a larger assessment. First of all, we know that mountain lions are really wide-ranging animals. They will not restrict themselves to Vermont. And so this study really needs to be more of a regional assessment. We need to bring in our partners from Quebec, New York, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, beyond. And that conversation really hasn't happened yet. We are, next week, my colleagues and I will be at a regional meeting in New Hampshire with all of our counterparts from the various state agencies. And we've asked that this topic get put on the agenda. And so we are starting the conversation with other leaders in the region, other partners, but it's just the initial parts of the conversation. So we really need to address that before we make an investment in a large study. And then I think we also need to take consideration to what extent that mountain lion reintroduction is a high priority compared to some of our other pressing conservation needs. We've come in and testified before saying that 50% of our mammal species in the state are species of greatest conservation need. And putting the resources in to reintroducing mountain lions would inevitably be taking resources away from species that are already currently here in the state that are declining and need our support. So it's certainly talking about a balance and what kind of conservation priorities the state has. So I'm going to pass the torch on to Dr. Renfrew so she can talk about some of the scientific review of kind of this whole feasibility idea. Yeah.
For the record, my name is Rosalind Renfrew, Wildlife Diversity Program Manager at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I want to echo the commissioner's thanks for inviting us to hear our perspective about this idea. And hopefully I'll try not to go on too long. There's a lot to this that I'm excited to share. And I want to start with the fact that, this is a really intriguing, inspiring, forward-thinking, kind of neat idea at a time when, we're looking at a lot of potential losses in terms of protections of endangered species on a broader scale. And so I find it to be intriguing in some ways, and can understand that people would get excited about this and excited about cascading effects that, should this project happen and be successful, that they could have as an apex predator, that mountain lions could have on the ecological community. So I understand the impetus behind and the interest behind this. And as an ecologist, I get it. And I actually had the closest experience I had to this was in Mexico doing field research. And one of my bird survey routes, another person I was working on had seen a jaguar at the very end of the route. It was like 5 kilometers long. And so I was really excited, thought maybe I'll get to see it, and I never did. But just the thought that it was out there was exciting to me, right? That like, wow, this must be a pretty healthy ecosystem to have this apex predator still alive on the landscape. And actually, they've done a lot of work, including Panthera, I believe, has done a lot of work in Mexico, trying to keep that population around. And they had a good, solid population to start with, but there's been threats from development, et cetera. And they've been able to sustain a really healthy, viable population across a really large area of land. So there's been success with augmenting or just protecting existing populations. This will be the first time that mountain lions will have been attempted to be reintroduced somewhere in North America, right? This is really, this is a much bigger deal. So today I just want to come at this from an ecological point of view. I'm not a sociologist. I don't look at human dimensions. I'm just going to talk about all the ecological facets of this sort of idea. So in addition to this being a first reintroduction, it's really a different scale from other reintroductions. It's really different from reintroducing species like turkeys or even marten. It's a really much higher level of input. There's a lot more questions and unknowns, I feel. So there's a lot more thinking that needs to be done in advance of moving forward with something like this. And I think that is the intent of the feasibility study that's proposed.
Are you thinking we're seeing your screen right now? Because we're not, and that's fine.
No. I'm just talking right now, and I'll bring up slides in a bit, for checking. I'm sure that's happened before. So as the commissioner stated, it also is a regional project. It's really not a state level project because of the nature of this animal. And I know you've heard about how the distances they travel. It really needs buy-in ahead of time before we commit resources to further looking into it. This is a project that would be probably hundreds of $millions over decades. This is a really big deal. We need to think very carefully, and we need to know everything we can possibly know in order to commit to something like this, and ask our partners and our neighboring states to commit. And it will always, if it happens and it happens successfully, it will always require a level of effort. It won't be sort of done. There will always be maintenance and management and human management, the human side of things that will be required, on an ongoing basis. So it's a really big deal. And we need a lot of information and a thorough evaluation in order to make an informed decision. So that's first and foremost is not only more information, but buy-in from our partners, our other states, the U.S. Forest Service. They would obviously have a big role in this with the Green Mountain National Forest, et cetera. So I'm now going to go to my slides just to dive into some of the science. I want to go back to some of the modeling work that's been done that was presented to this committee in the past. I know you hear a lot of different presentations, so I won't assume you'll be able to, remember everything you've heard in the past. Let me just set this up. Great. So I'm hoping this rings a bell, this image on the right-hand side, which was the result of a modeling paper that a grad student carried out. And the image on the left, those yellow dots are the locations of the mountain lions that they use to collect information about the sort of habitat those mountain lions, or they call them cougars out there, right? are inhabiting out in the West. And they take that information and they use what those mountain lions are responding to as a way to predict what they might respond to elsewhere. And let's see. And so what we're looking at is, they can't look at what they respond to in the East, right? They have to use those locations in the West to try to gain some sense of where the mountain lions occur. And what they show is that anywhere that's blue is has a high probability that mountain lions could use it, that there's habitat there. It's a little more complicated than that, because what the model actually is based on and driven by is the greenness of the vegetation of an area. So there's this vegetation index that's really commonly used. I've used it in my research, that shows the primary productivity of an area, how lush and green, how much vegetative growth there is. And that in turn is used in this study to talk about where there's prey for mountain lions. You have more vegetation, more lushness, more greenness, more primary productivity. It's going to give prey items for mountain lion stuff to eat, right? So it's trying to make that connection of, it's very green. There's a lot of stuff on the landscape for mountain lions to eat. Therefore, this is good habitat. There's two other variables, two other factors that also were important, less important than that index, which was elevation. The mountain lions prefer to be below 1,000 feet, and that they like to have water within 5 kilometers. That all makes sense to me, that would be important drivers. But these are really big overarching drivers of where we might expect some suitable habitat to be. There's obviously a lot of other factors to consider. And they say this, they say that their map does, sorry, I have some things in my way here, that their map does show that there's habitat in the West, and you could say habitat in the East, possibly superior to habitat in the West. But this is likely due to that vegetation index that's driving that result. And they concede that the model is really a generalized prediction of where the habitat could exist, but that there's other factors not reflected in their model. And they say, well, nevertheless, even considering the human footprint in the East, our model supports other analyses. And they cite a couple of papers and that predicts significant mountain lion habitat beyond their current range. So what they're showing is there's the vegetation to support the prey, to support the mountain lions in parts of their historical range, other than where they currently occur in the West. And that makes sense. But their models are, one thing important to understand is that this modeling is very coarse, it's very broad, it's across the entire continent. And of course, there's a lot of other factors to consider. And that's been discussed as well. But first of all, before I get to that, one of the papers they cite is this one as supporting their work. This map shows expert opinion, kind of characterized in data form about habitat suitability outside their current range. And it includes different parameters that I could get into, but I won't right here. But it comes up with an assessment of habitat suitability, and the darker, the better. And so you can see Canada is just, obviously this massive area where they're saying it's suitable. And then when you look in the Northeast, you see that Maine is suitable, and the Adirondacks pop out a little bit, and Vermont not so much. So while this paper supports their broad findings, if you try to drill down to Vermont, it's not supporting the idea that Vermont is the best place to do this work, or the best place for mountain lions. And then they go on to also look at the percent suitability of the habitat, and they look at area thresholds. This one is the larger one they looked at, 2,500 kilometers squared, which they're saying that's what mountain lions would need. And so they further cut out, of that huge area that's suitable, what areas are actually are more realistic to consider. Again, Maine pops out a bit, the Adirondacks pop out, and Canada's huge, and Vermont's not in there. So this is a study they cite, but the results actually aren't consistent in terms of that smaller scale, in Vermont. This is another paper that they cite, which is actually does get at some of those other factors. So it's actually very helpful, and it's a helpful companion to the big blue map. Because it does look at factors such as land cover and forest cover, snow depth, housing density, human development proximity, highway proximity, and livestock density. These are all things known to influence where mountain lions go. So this study is really helpful in giving a deeper dive into the other factors that might influence where you'd see mountain lions. And so I'm hoping this looks familiar to you, that maybe you remember this from past testimony. And let's see. So they circle that area in northern Vermont and parts of northern New Hampshire, and talk about why that didn't pop out as a suitable area. And so all the green areas there are considered having potential for mountain lion because they're big enough blocks of contiguous habitat. And one of the pieces of information that went into figuring that out was highways, interstate highways. So because I-81, I-93, I-91 are all present in that area, it took that area out of consideration as potential habitat, because road crossing hills are such an important factor for mountain lions, even though there's a lot of forest there. And so this was sort of the way it was presented, it was dismissed as a side effect of the study because of that 0 to 1 scoring of the highways. One is they're present and they're horrible. I'm sorry, 1 is they're not present and we're all good. 0 is they're present, and that takes the habitat out of being suitable because there's just going to be too many car strikes. The problem is it's probably more nuanced than that. It may be influenced by traffic volume, right? Whether or not a highway is really problematic. But we don't have those data. Maybe it should be 0.5 in some places and 0.2 in others, depending on traffic volume in terms of how important it is to determine if the habitat is suitable. But we simply lack that information. And so knowing that highways are such an important source of mortality for this species elsewhere, it had to really drive, it had to be a 1 instead of a 0. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It also means that, and the authors talk about this, that area 2 in southern New Hampshire, that's shown as suitable, but it has a lot of highways. It has a lot of roads. It has a lot of traffic. And because of that, it actually might not be suitable. So they concede that, we need to look at traffic. It's a significant factor. Oops, there we go. In addition to major interstates, what we haven't looked at are all the other roads in Vermont. There's a lot more roads in Vermont than out west on average. And I believe that our state highways would have an impact. I believe that there are plenty of people going 50, 60 miles an hour. There's plenty of traffic, commuters, tourists, what have you. It's not something we can write off. It's definitely something that I would encourage a grad student work on to really assess what are the potential impacts of those roads. And the reason being, because we don't want to invest resources into this project or even do a feasibility study yet until we know if this is really possible, given our particulars of our landscape in this state and then also in our neighboring states. So I would strongly recommend that that sort of assessment be done to give us a better picture that is more scaled down more to our state and our region. All I could dig up for this is moose and kills of moose. Moose are not mountain lions, and there's more moose than there ever would be mountain lions. So, but it's all we have. Last year there were 30 moose mortalities from vehicles, and only 11 of those were on interstates, and the rest of those were on secondary roads, on state highways or other roads. Again, moose are not mountain lions, but it's just all we got. Like, it happens, right? I would think moose would be there would be lower percent kills of moose just because they just stand there, so you can like stop. But I really don't know. That's another thing we'd have to look into. The other piece is forest structure. We have forest. We all know that the vast majority is sort of middle-aged forest. We have proportionally much less forest on the young end and on the old end. And what would that mean for them and their prey? There's just all these more structural attributes, understory, all these other factors that would need to be considered in terms of prey density, behavior of the mountain lions. They do like using trails. They'll go to areas with trails before they'll go use areas without trails. And they like using dirt roads for traveling on. And so what does that mean for us? If they're on dirt roads, does that present other risks, or are we not likely to hit them with our car because they're just traveling along the very edge of the road and they're not going to cross in front of it? You know, we just don't know. Okay. I think that's my last slide. Can't see the thing. Oh no. So then the other part about this study is you know, we're looking at those top two areas in terms of these areas that are really connected, or areas that are really contiguous within the Northeast. You know, these are the two circled areas are the ones in their study that are Vermont, or at least mostly Vermont. But they're some of the smallest areas they identified with contiguous habitat. Are we looking at all those other areas below those? So you get, as you go down the table, the areas get bigger. So the bigger, the better, right? The more mountain lions you can have, the more contiguous habitat, the better. Potentially the fewer conflicts with humans. Should we be, you know, kind of expanding our vision beyond Vermont? Why are all these other places, and maybe they are, but why isn't this being pursued in these bigger places where there may be more potential? And getting back to the roads issue, I just wanted to show, you know, the one example we have that's anywhere close to what this endeavor would be is Florida, where, you know, they call them Pumas or Black Panthers there. It's a different subspecies, but it's still mountain lion. And they've had a long time, you know, effort trying to restore their population. They started about 30 years ago. They had 20 to 30 natural, you know, panthers that were, you know, already living there in their natural habitat, but it's such a small population that they were very fearful of inbreeding. And they were also fearful that, you know, they would just die off. And they started a program in you know, about 30 years ago. They brought, I think it was 7 or 8 panthers from Texas, not so much just to add to the population, but to add to the genetic diversity of the population that was left because they were becoming too inbred. And so they really limited how many they were adding to that population. And instead, they just made sure that they were genetically more healthy. And then they did all the other conservation pieces that needed to happen to support the growth of that population. And it was it was actually quite successful. They managed to get the population up to somewhere between 120 and 230 individuals. It's very hard to estimate the population accurately with these. Roadkills were the #1 source of mortality. And unfortunately, now they're also dealing with a disorder, and they don't know the cause. And they've termed it feline leukomyelopathy. But they're still trying to figure out the cause of that disorder. Let's see. And so just some data on the roadkills in Florida. You can see that over the years they've increased. Well, that's in part because the population increased. So you just have more opportunity for a roadkill to occur. But it's still pretty significant number of panthers being killed, despite a lot of projects going into developing road crossings so that they can safely cross the busy highways in Florida. There isn't a lot of highway, but what is there is, high traffic volume, and there's significant mortality. So, last year there was 29. I believe they lost 36 individuals last year. I'm not sure what the other 7 were for, but 29 of them were car strikes. And you can see that in recent years, since about 2017, there's been a decline overall in car strikes. I think that's probably because the crossings that they've built have really made a significant difference in helping out this population. So those look something like this. They put a lot of resource into this. They've also been strategically purchasing land, setting that aside, giving them more space. If any of you have been to Florida, there's a lot of development happening. There's a lot of roads, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of houses, depending on where you are. In the South there's less. They're in the South for a reason. Just in the last year, the state provided $130 million for building more road crossings. And they have 60 of them now. They have another 12 slated to be added. Each of them could be anywhere from $5 to $20 million. And yet they still had, they still have these kills, these road kills. So they still have to have enough of a population that can replace the ones that are being lost. One of the papers that I talked about today has said that the population will probably require further conservation support via the translocation of pumas from elsewhere to boost the genetic diversity in Florida. So they're still needing to perhaps add more pumas from elsewhere. Florida has 600 staff working on habitat and species conservation. I don't know how many of those work on the panther. Somebody mentioned 4 full-time biologists work just on this species. So all that to say, this is a substantial effort in Florida anyway. Let's see. I need to stop sharing. Am I good?
Mhm.
Okay.
Are you upset?
Oh, I have more.
Okay.
If I'm not taking too much time. So to get down into the feasibility study, so the bill suggests that the feasibility study should address the impact of reintroduction, including on species of concern, whether there's an adequate amount of suitable habitat in the state to support a population, whether there are adequate prey populations in the state, whether there is a genetically suitable source population. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm interested in understanding what genetically suitable translates to, and to also understand the probable survival rates of the animals that are introduced. I suggest that these kinds of information gaps are not for a suitability study, they're for grad students. Like you could put a grad student on each one of those things to inform a feasibility study. But a feasibility study, those are big questions that require we look more into some of I just brought up a few of the questions that I have that remain to figure out if a feasibility study is then warranted. And then if so, the feasibility study, the way I look at them is that they would assess how the public, okay, ecologically, we think we can pull this off. The states around us are supportive. They're ready to take on their end of the commitment, because those catamounts that would not be killed by vehicles are going to make it into other states. It's inevitable. So we would want to see that they're on board and they're ready to go. We want to do the whole human dimensions piece and the whole financial assessment of what it would take to pull off. So those are all the pieces that I see a feasibility study realistically being able to tackle, and that is appropriate for a feasibility study. I think we have more research to do before that. And then the other piece, I think, to ground ourselves in is the cost of a feasibility study itself. Even if what I'm talking about is what's taken on, it will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do it properly. For example, we just did a strategic decision-making process, which is this whole process you go through to figure out a problem with a lot of stakeholders. And we did this on chronic wasting disease, which is threatening to come into Vermont and would affect moose, would affect deer. And it would spread to most of the population. And what we can do to prevent that, what we would do if it happens and we have to react to it. And the USGS led that, and with a grad student and some university people, and it was $460,000. And then there was a public survey that was $40,000 or $50,000. And it took 800 hours of our staff time and 400 hours of 7 other partners' time. And it took 2.5 years. I don't think they're done yet. And that's not even involving other states, as far as I'm aware. And then, so finally, even if there are deep pockets supporting this work, and that, there can be someone else who's contracted out to do a lot of this work, it is going to inevitably be a pull on our resources, on our attention towards the other work we're doing. It's unavoidable. It really is. We have 217 threatened and endangered species in the state. We have 1,330 species of greatest conservation need. We're supposed to be taking care of all of those. We get to a teeny percentage of them. And also, one of my honest concerns is this, are we saying that this is a priority among those needs? I mean, we would be saying that by doing this, because it will pull resources and attention, even if it's well-funded. And so that's a concern of mine. We have about 1 biologist for every major taxonomic group that we're responsible for. So we have 1 botanist for the thousands of plant species, and 163 of them are endangered or threatened, for example. In 2022, we removed a couple species from our endangered species list, but we added 5 more, or upgraded 5 more. And now we already have other species that we're lining up that probably need to be listed, unfortunately, because they continue to decline. We also protect rare natural communities, a very important part of our work. That's Bob Zano's work. He's very engaged, as you know, in all the Act 59. That's another example, actually, of the kind of process that needs to happen to think through this, is the Act 59 planning. He's also involved now in the Act 181 planning. That stuff's really important to the state of Vermont. It's really high priority for us, but it meant that he had to give up some of his work doing the natural communities. We made that decision, right? Even though there's some money available, it just doesn't always, it just doesn't always work out that way, that we can really keep doing everything we're doing. And there's all these other things that could really use the added attention and resources. So for example, we are still dealing with white nose syndrome. We are by no means out of the woods with that. No pun intended. we have 5 endangered species. They're still very low populations, and it's not like there's been a fix yet or a solution yet to that. We need to keep our eye on it, and our small mammals biologist, who's amazing, and I hope you have a chance to learn from her at some point if it comes up. She can't even get to the terrestrial small mammals because she's just so busy dealing with the bats. And we don't even know basic things about the terrestrial small mammals, some of them. We have, let's see, is it 61 mammals in the state, and over half of them are species of greatest conservation need species. So just with mammals, we have a lot going on. And then, of course, we're doing the work that Bob Zano has come in and talked about a lot, which we think is really important with Vermont conservation design. We definitely see the direct benefits from that and the applicability and the importance, given all the recent legislation, especially. So I could go on about, the other needs, invertebrates, pollinators, diseases that threaten amphibians and birds. There's a lot going on already. So we have to be mindful of what our priorities are and how to arrange those priorities. So
I do want to make sure we have other.
I'll stop there.
To the bill. No, that was great. It was very helpful. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. So I want to make sure that we maintain time for that.
Just before we go to questions, and I just want to say that we're not being dismissive of this idea at all. We just feel like there's a lot of other questions that need to be talked about before we embark on a feasibility study. The rest of the bill, H230, is really good governance. It's time sensitive. It's good for the people of Vermont. It's good for the wildlife. We're good with the language that came out of the Judiciary Committee, and it's all ready to move forward. And so if we could amend the bill, remove this language so we could take a part of the discussions with our partners in the region, be part of the workshop that Panthera is putting on in Burlington in the fall, so we can talk to scientists from all over with vast experience from different organizations, and then come back to the committee in December with a recommendation and a report. I think that would be ideal for us, and just so we can properly address all of the kind of questions and the regional concern with this study. So leave it at that.
Members have questions on this aspect of H230. I do want to get to testimony we heard yesterday that I hope you all heard too. Members have thoughts on this. Representative.
Just real quickly. So what I'm hearing is that there used to be catamarans here, and I don't know in what numbers, but due to traffic and highways, that their existence here would be challenging due to basically the traffic, the highways. Is that pretty accurate?
I think we don't know. It certainly adds a lot of challenge, and it would present challenges. What degree and what would need to be done to counter that? The level and scale of the measures needed to counter that is what I'm wanting us to have a better sense of.
Do you have any idea how many, like when it was robust, the population, how many were here? No.
No. When was the last mountain lion here?
1897.
90.
Yeah, so that was a long time ago. I don't know.
Nobody was
They weren't
keeping
doing
data.
population studies.
They weren't now. Okay.
So really, there's.
I
no way.
wish we had that kind of information for all the species.
Yeah.
But I was gonna add, and for the record, Katharina Geter, I work for Vermont Fish and Wildlife. There's also habitat quality and food source concerns because Vermont forests are very different from what they were in the 1800s. So our forests really have a major issue of lacking diversity in terms of their structure and their age. We have really even-aged forests, and that makes it really hard to maintain deer populations in the state, especially where most of our forests occur along the spine of the Green Mountains and things like that. So even the question of whether there's enough understory for a species like mountain lions and whether there would be enough prey sources to sustain a population long-term, that would be a major concern that we want to look into because currently we don't have information on that.
Representative Bartholomew.
You're suggesting an alternate approach from a feasibility study. Would that be legislative, something in legislation, different language?
Well, I guess you all are the experts on that. I am recommending removing the language from this bill, from H 230, keeping it as its separate bill. And I guess it could take legislation, or we can just keep moving forward on it on our own to have this conversation with our partners and be part of the workshop in the fall.
And my other question is, I think you said hundreds of millions to reintroduce. That seems extraordinarily high.
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions.
Well, I think for 30 years of work and those underpasses that are millions of dollars each, maybe I'm overestimating. I don't know what they've spent total. They've also acquired a lot of land. That really jumps up the price if that was part of it. But I was unable to find like some number, like this is how much money we've put into it. It's had a lot of partners contributing their funds. I think it's safe to say they've put that much into Florida, especially if you include the underpasses.
Florida's a very different place.
It is.
In
Yep.
terms of population and roads.
Well, yeah, in the Southwest where they occur, again, I don't know how to compare that. We don't have enough information. It's just the only example we have to look at, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to mountain lions, they are a slowly reproducing species. They don't produce a lot of young compared to a lot of other wildlife species, and it takes them a while to bring up their young compared to other wildlife species. So all that taken into account, this would be a longer term process. So it's not like per year, but it's over that really decadal
Yeah.
time scale. That would be important. I was going to say, perhaps one idea is that usually if a feasibility study is going to be conducted or a structured decision-making process is going to be started, prior to that, there's usually a literature review and an assessment of like what information do we actually have. So that might be one idea of something that might be a starting point.
I appreciate your thoroughness. I have a few questions myself. I was going to ask about the hundreds of millions of dollars, which seemed, I mean, I think one thing that really strikes me is a lot of this work is stuff we probably need to be doing anyway. If we're losing 30 moose a year to highway roadkills in Vermont, and we know that's a public safety issue for human beings, but it's also a concern for wildlife. And I would say one of the things we know when we're thinking about landscape restoration is that, taking care of those largest animals often takes care of everybody else. So I think separating this out there may not be the best way to look at it as a single project, but that there would be many holistic benefits that could happen if we did this. And a lot of the questions you brought up seem like things that could be in a feasibility study. Maybe that's a technical term that means something different to biologists, and it is something else that we need to do. And I appreciate that, and I'm ready for that. And I also appreciate the fact that you've, despite feeling overwhelmed, have actually taken this seriously, and you're talking to our neighbors and you're pursuing this and interested in engaging at a level that you can do now. And I guess I feel I like to kind of get a handle on that. I wanted to just say that the language in here was a starting place based on what other states had done to reintroduce other animals. I don't remember which exactly from where, but a couple in statute that were feasibility studies that our council found in statute. And that's where that came from. It wasn't intended to be a finished product, but a beginning conversation. And I guess one thing is looking at that map and knowing that there are mountain lions in Canada, and understanding that, I mean, a lot of this feels like fear, and I understand that. And I think one of the reasons Vermont came out was that the social work that they did do showed that Vermonters were more interested than some of those other places that might have larger areas of contiguous habitat. We're going to keep hearing from the scientists who did that work and understand more about what it meant. But one thing I would ask is, what are you doing to prepare for the return of predators? We know that there's wolves in Canada, there's catamounts in Canada. Vermonters need to understand how to be prepared for that so that it isn't just a fear-based response, if and when they come back here, despite what humans do. And I think I would just put that out there and say, in addition to what you're thinking of, we should be ready to help Vermonters understand if they do run into a larger species or, anyway, that's just something that popped into my head.
It's a good point. And I also think, perhaps when you speak with the biologists tomorrow or the researchers tomorrow, I think there's a difference in questions of, are people supportive of reintroducing this species versus are people supportive of living with that species? I think there's some nuance to that. And it would just be an interesting thing to ask and look into that.
Yeah, I think it was pretty extensive. I heard their presentation a couple of years ago now, and it seemed like they might have gone there. Anyway, thank you. I look forward to working with you on this. I hear you that you don't want it in H230, and I'm open to taking that out. We do have some questions about H230. So yesterday we heard from Jim Andrews, who he just brought to our attention the area around, it's on page 7, under reptiles and amphibians, section 4085, and the opportunity for creating a season on reptiles and amphibians, and question that, which also brought me to questioning what is a common species and who decides what that is, and establishing open seasons. We've had trouble with other open seasons. That's like item number 4. Not sure why we would create another open season on anything at this point. And then, so that I'd like a response to that, and what is a common species and who decides what that is.
Well, my understanding, and I think the Colonel could speak to this best, but my understanding is that we, in providing the opportunity for the commissioner to create rules around harvest of some species, I don't have the language right in front of me right now. I don't know where common is used. Oh,
It's
Okay,
13,
so-
14.
so that could probably be wordsmith, because common species could include a lot of things. And I think what the intent of the bill is for species that are not of conservation concern, species that are abundant, that are, that can have some amount of harvest without it causing a decrease in the overall population. And what we were trying to do with the bill with that is to acknowledge that there are a few people, probably not many, that would harvest, that do harvest snapping turtles or green frogs, and they actually eat them. And so we were trying to not ban everything for people with those interests. So it become, a limit of how many people could take, just like any other species that's allowed to be hunted. So,
And
and that hasn't been figured out yet, what that would be, what species and how many, that would be in rulemaking. But I know that our herpetologist, Luke Groff, and the Colonel have already had conversations about what that could look like and what the limits would be, but that all would have to be figured out in rulemaking.
And I believe right now, because there's no rules or season around it, I think you can take any species at any time. And so establishing rules would have some restrictions on that. But I know that there's a potential for you all to vote on this after lunch, but I can reach out to the Colonel during lunch and get back to you on that.
That's fine. You can, I'm happy to have his input on that, but also the biologist's input on back to abundant and understanding that we're kind of in abundance crisis. Like we don't, and in fact, just as noted, we don't know how many catamounts were once here. we actually don't have a clear handle on what abundance really means and how that informs the decision about what's a common species.
Mhm.
So I guess if that's like, this sounds like it's common practice. I'm just curious about how you quantify what abundance is in deciding how many animals get taken in any species of our seasons. And yeah.
Input on that.
No, I mean, it's a good question. These are species, I mean, you could further define what is meant. You could say species that are not of greatest conservation need. You could say, species. In the end, I think this would amount to very few individuals taken. It would allow us to track what's taken. And if there's cause for concern that we're seeing declines in the species populations, we would change the rules in response, but
Under number 5, it could do that. Number 4, an open season common species, that's very broad and wouldn't allow any tracking as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
And so I might strike that one. Sure. And then Jim Andrews also was pretty clear in advising not to eat snapping turtles at all because they bioaccumulate. They live a long time. They have a high tolerance for toxicity and they bioaccumulate. So anyone out there who's listening who eats snapping turtles, you're advised
Not
to know exactly where they've spent their 80 years
very good point.
prior to ingesting them. Other thoughts that members remember from comments on the bill? Right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you very
much. That was very
Thank you.
informative. Thank you.
Members, we're adjourned until 10 minutes after the floor. Yeah.